Suppose it's all true, and you walk up to the pearly gates and you are confronted by God. What will Stephen Fry say to him, her, or it?
I will basically, what's known as theodicy, I think. I'll say, bone cancer in children? What's that about? How dare you? How dare you create a world in which there is such misery that is not our fault? It's not right. It's utterly, utterly evil. Why should I respect a capricious, mean-minded, stupid God who creates a world which is so full of injustice and pain? That's what I'd say.
And you think you're going to get in on
No,
that?
but I wouldn't want to. I wouldn't want to get in on his terms. They're wrong. Yes, the world is very splendid, but it also has in it insects whose whole life cycle is to burrow into the eyes of children and make them blind. They eat outwards from the eyes. Why? Why did you do that to us? You could easily have made a creation in which that didn't exist. It is simply not acceptable.
Wow, that's quite a bit of hate and hate speech and blasphemy coming from 58-year-old Stephen Fry, who, by the way, just married his 27-year-old boyfriend this in 2015 in London, so congratulations to the happy young couple. But this whole sort of spiel seems a little nuts to me. I mean, why would he be so angry at something that doesn't even exist? It's sort of like hiding your own Easter eggs. What's the point? But this nutty madness we're seeing and this angst against Christ, this Christophobia we see from all over the place is indicative of the modernist chickens in the Catholic Church once again coming home to roost. The Catholic Church is no longer an effective teacher. Her message is not getting out, and the world is going mad without that message. Because you remember how uncomplicated this used to be before the church got sophisticated? Men and women for 1,000 years just accepted on faith that Noah actually built that big boat, that Jonah actually did spend 3 days inside the whale, just like Jesus would later confirm, and that the Red Sea did, in fact, part and then close on Pharaoh's army. How can we believe such unsophisticated, childish, non-scientific rot? This is 2015, right? And we're back in the dark ages with this. But the problem with that attitude, which you see everywhere now today, is that are we Christians actually going to allow our scientific friends to tell us how believable our theology on the Eucharist is as well? I mean, if our faith is to be based on what can be proven by scientific evidence, then what is to become of that little white piece of bread that we say is God, the Eucharist, the creator of the universe? That'll be the first thing to go. The biblical account of creation is comparatively easy, and it presented few obstacles for believers for thousands of years. God created the universe out of nothing. He saw that it was good and desired to share it. So he creates Adam and creates Eve in his own image and likeness, and he gives our first parents every gift and then tested their fidelity to him. They failed the test and fell from grace, and all of nature fell with them. So, Mr. Fry, your sin, your bone cancer, the eye problem with the kids, all of the sickness in the world and the death, it entered the world even as the serpent sort of slithered out of that Garden of Eden that we read about in Sunday school. Even children understood that God's design had been upended by our first parents' choice to disobey him. Toddlers could see that God didn't create sickness, suffering, and death, but that these were the results of man's disobedience and the horrors of sin. And in this case, it was a sin committed by the first man who had actually walked with God and was in possession of preternatural gifts. Adam knew what he was doing. His fall brought an end to the paradise of God's design and placed the entire human race and all of nature itself in need of redemption, in need of a second chance, which God grants to us. So today, when a little child runs into the street and is struck and killed by a passing automobile after chasing her ball into the street, her father needn't clench his fists and shake them at the heavens and blame God for killing my baby. The child simply forgot to look both ways, and she was killed in an accident. Her death occurred in the natural order of things. This is why parents teach their children safety rules, traffic rules in the first place, because it is quite possible for children to suffer and die before their time. It happens all the time. And if God is simply going to kill the little girl on some bizarre divine whim, he wants to just snuff her out, then why teach her safety rules to begin with? Why not just encourage her to close her eyes and blast out into the street and see if it's her time to go or not? This defies reason and logic. Or take suicide, for example. God does not will that that poor fellow should jump from the bridge into the rocks below to his death. But he allows it. In the natural order of things, he allows it according to the man's free will. Now, God didn't kill the man on the bridge any more than he killed the little girl chasing her ball into the street. For most of human history, men and women, far from blaming God for bone cancer in kids or Down syndrome or earthquakes or fire, they chose to pray to him for protection in the event of a bad choice or a bad gene or a bad storm, or if nature should suddenly rise up against them in the form of a flood or an earthquake or whatever. They prayed to him. Sensible people prayed to him. They weren't civilized yet. To this day, we Catholics, for example, pray to St. Christopher before a long road trip, right? Why do we do this? Is it to ask Christopher to run quick like a bunny and talk God out of killing us that day as he's planned for all eternity? No, God can't change his mind. Of course not. We seek Christopher's intercession against the non-discriminating and often ruthless forces of Mother Nature, Mother fallen nature, we might say. We pray for the intercession of God's saints and angels every day so that they may help us, so they may intervene on our behalf in a natural order of things that is very, very dangerous. Those heavenly interventions, what do we call them? We call them miracles. And those miracles offer further proof that we are not alone in this world, that God is with us, that prayer is powerful, that God is not a cold and heartless puppet master, and that the power of prayer is very real. In fact, we rely on it even against the great forces of nature, such as tornadoes and fire and cancer. And to show us that not one of us can be spared the suffering Adam's sin brought into this world, God himself comes down from heaven, hangs on a cross, and dies, thus offering men the ultimate sermon on redemptive suffering. Everything about salvation and the history of the world must be seen through the prism of the fall of Adam and Eve, original sin, suffering, death, the incarnation, the virgin birth, all the sacraments, the resurrection, the Catholic Church, all of it. It all came about because Lucifer did not serve and Adam did not obey. These are the truths of our religion. This is the salvation history that we're talking about. All of Christendom knew this. The fathers, the doctors, the saints, the martyrs down through the ages knew it. And we want to call it myth, or we want to talk about evolution, which is becoming so problematic today, the heresy of evolution, which is being used to undermine Genesis, to undermine salvation history, to undermine the incarnation, to undermine the Catholic Church, to undermine the very existence of God himself. Pope Leo XIII, in Arcanum Divinae Sapientiae in 1880, described the Genesis account of the creation of Eve from Adam's rib as, quote, what is to all known and what cannot be doubted by any. The First Vatican Council, 1869 to 1870, taught that this sole God immediately, from the beginning of time, fashioned each creature out of nothing, spiritual and corporeal. And the council goes on to say, if anyone does not confess that the world and all things which are contained in it, both spiritual and material, as regards their whole substance, have been produced by God from nothing, let him be anathema. This was the teaching of the church 150 years ago. Infallible teaching. A little more recent, the Pontifical Biblical Commission issued a decree in 1909, and this one was ratified by St. Pius X, which states that the literal historical meaning of the first chapters of Genesis could not be doubted in regard to the creation by God at the beginning of time. The special creation of man, the formation of the first woman from the first man, and the unity of the human race. That's what the church taught. And today?
So are you talking about a kind of Garden of Eden scenario with an actual Adam and Eve?
Well, what Adam and Eve terms, what do they mean? Life and earth. It's like every man. That's a beautiful, sophisticated, mythological account. It's not science, but it's there to tell us two or three things. First of all, that God created the world and the universe. Secondly, that the key to the whole of the universe, the really significant thing, are humans. And thirdly, it's a very sophisticated mythology to try to explain the evil and the suffering
But
of the
it isn't
world.
a literal truth. You shouldn't see it in any way as being an historical or literal truth.
It's certainly not a scientific truth, and it's a religious story told for religious purposes.
I'm going to bring Richard Dawkins back in here because we've moved from evolution, obviously, to the biblical versions of it. Your response?
Well, I'm curious to know if Adam and Eve never existed, where did original sin come from?
Why is baptism so important? If Adam and Eve, our first parents who committed that original sin that baptism washes away, if they didn't even exist? This is insanity. We're now hearing from conservative churchmen, high-ranking princes of the church, that Adam and Eve maybe didn't even exist. The reality is God created us from nothing. Not from monkeys, not from slime, not from dolphins, not from Neanderthals, but from nothing. And Adam and Eve were real people who committed a real sin, just as Pope Pius XII reiterates as recently as 1950 in Humani Generis. Number 37 states, original sin proceeds from a sin actually committed by an individual named Adam. As I say, every Sunday school kid knew this 100 years ago. Not so anymore. This teaching of the Church is reiterated again, even more recently, in the new Catechism of the Catholic Church, which repeatedly speaks of a real Adam and a real Eve. You can check out reference 374, 387, 377, 402, 416, 417. It's throughout. This is the infallible teaching of our Church. And suffering can only be understood and indeed valued if and when it is seen as a result of original sin, as recorded in the book of Genesis, bringing about the fall of human nature. God did not invent cancer and leukemia and earthquakes just for the fun of it, because he was bored. He allows evil and suffering that resulted from the fall, and that fall is detailed in the sacred books of our religion. Miracles are real. Prayer is powerful. God is with us, and his Son, Jesus Christ, taught us how to deal with suffering, to Christianize it, if you will. When he hung from a wooden cross, suffocating from the weight of his own physical body, and pouring out every drop of his blood through holes that were torn in his flesh by the hands of real men. So no, Mr. Fry, you're wrong. You're dead wrong, and I think you know you're wrong. You're just an angry and spoiled brat who's shaking his fists at God and acting like a little child. But for thousands of years, men of all civilizations and all creeds and all skin color knew that God exists, that suffering is permitted and not willed by God. So Mr. Fry, your blasphemy is so stupid, and it's so stale, and it's so old. I'm just going to let an old, retiring, aging rock star answer your nonsense. I'm going to let Bono from the rock band U2 handle this one, if you don't mind. Bono, take it away.
I think it's a defining question for a Christian, is who was Christ, and I don't think you're let off easily by saying a great thinker or a great philosopher, or because actually he went round saying he was the Messiah. That's why he was crucified. He was crucified because he said he was the Son of God. So he either, in my view, was the Son of God, or he was
Not.
No, nuts.
Nuts, yes.
Forget rock and roll messianic complexes. This is like, Charlie Manson type delirium. And I find it hard to accept that all the millions and millions of lives, half the earth, for 2,000 years, have been touched, have felt their lives touched and inspired by some nutter. I don't believe it. I
So
think,
therefore it follows that you believe he was divine.
yes,
And therefore it follows that you believe that he rose physically from the dead.
yes, yeah. I'm no problem with miracles. I'm living around them. I am one.
Exactly. From St. Paul, Minnesota, I am Michael Matt. Thank you very much for joining us. Be sure to visit our website every day to follow more on this story and all the other breaking stories that are taking place this week. Thank you so much. God bless, and we'll see you next week.